You're listening to the Born to Kick Arse podcast with Matt Tomasi and can be found at borntokickarse.com/episode 65.
Welcome to the Born to Kick Arse podcast, where you're introduced to the most fascinating people on the planet. Learn the ingredients of greatness that you can apply to your life. And now your host, Matthew Tomasi.
Ed Stafford was European Adventurer of the Year in 2011 and holds the Guinness World Record for walking 4,000 miles along the entire length of the Amazon River from source to sea. Ed filmed and blogged his deadly journey and engaged followers all over the world for 2.5 years. Ed is also the star of a number of survival-based documentary TV series on the Discovery Channel, including Walking the Amazon, Marooned with Ed Stafford, and Ed Stafford Into the Unknown. Enjoy the interview. Ed Stafford, welcome to the Born to Kick Arse podcast.
Thank you, Matthew.
You've got an incredible story. You walked, I think it was around about 4,000 miles from the source of the Amazon River through to the sea. From, what was it, from west to east?
It was from west to east, yeah. The source of the Amazon is quite near to the Pacific coast, actually. It's in the Andes, obviously, but obviously the Andes come quite close to the Pacific. So we actually did an entire sort of continental crossing and walked from the coast up and over the Andes, followed the course of the river, essentially, through the whole of Peru, pretty much, the southern tip of Colombia, and then right across Brazil to the Atlantic Ocean, yeah.
So how did this idea kick off? Like what sort of motivated you to want to attempt something so massive?
I think deep down within me, I've always wanted to do something really big, and something that I could potentially look back on and be proud of. I was very outdoorsy as a kid. I was a cub and a scout, and I played lots of sport and lots of rugby, and so I was quite a physical person. And I ended up joining the army, but it wasn't really my bag. I don't think I was particularly interested in going to war and didn't really want to fight. But it was the outdoors that was really the attraction. So when I left, I fell into doing expeditions, and they were scientific expeditions and conservation expeditions, and they were nothing too extreme. But one thing led to another, and I found myself sort of 10 years out of the army, having done a lot of expeditions. So I'd got quite a bit of experience, and I literally, coming back to the sort of wanting to do something that I was really proud of, I looked around the world for something big. And bizarrely, although I'd been to lots of rainforests all over the world, Central America and the Far East, I hadn't been to the Amazon, and I just thought, wouldn't it be amazing to do a kayaking journey all the way down the Amazon? And so I started Googling, and then annoyingly found all of these other expeditions that had kayaked down the Amazon. And so I thought, okay, I can't do that. That's not going to be quite big enough. And I just started looking for expeditions that had walked the length of the Amazon, because I read some of the kayaking books, like Running the Amazon by Joe Kane, the American, which was an extraordinary book, and thought it's amazing. But these guys are getting shot at by Indians, but they're indigenous Indians, and then they're just like flying past on their kayaks. Wouldn't it be far more immersive, far more intense if you were actually walking through? And so you were standing face to face with all these guys and trying to prove that you weren't a threat, or you weren't a danger to them. And so I came up with the concept of walking the Amazon, and the more I looked, the more I realised that nobody had ever done it before. And so I just chanced upon a world first, really, which of course helped the expedition massively. Yeah.
Now, your time in the army, did your sort of skills and the knowledge that you gained in the army, did that really pay off on this massive expedition? Like in terms of survival and sort of, the skills that you learnt from the army, did you actually apply that to the Amazon experience?
I think basically, although the very basics that I needed in order to conduct the expedition were, I don't know, can I pack a rucksack? Can I live out of a rucksack? Can I camp in a hammock? Can I wash in a river? Can I, administrate my feet so that I don't get trench foot or immersion foot? But they weren't high level skills. I hadn't done any sort of specific specialist survival training in the military, but I think what the military did give me, because I started with a colleague, a friend of mine called Luke, and he always made a big point of the fact that he was doing this without military experience, but he ended up leaving after 3 months because for him it was the hardest thing he'd ever done. I think he was absolutely at his wit's end. But I think the thing that the military really gave me was the fact that they pushed me so hard in training and on operations, so that I knew that I'd always done something tougher and before, and I knew I'd been physically pushed harder. And I think it was really nice to have that in the back of my mind, that, although this is difficult, it's not the hardest thing I've ever done, therefore I can keep going. And I think for me that was the biggest thing that the military gave me. I have to admit, over time, the time I spent in the military played sort of less and less significance over the expedition. I learned so much as I went, and I certainly had to take my military hat off, because you couldn't be too regimented about it. You couldn't stick to strict timings, because the local guys just would laugh at you, and they completely operate on a different sort of time schedule. And so I think, more and more, especially after finishing the expedition and doing the work that I do now, I think it's sorry, my dog is just knocking the chair over. I think it ends up being stuff that I've learned off local people, off indigenous tribes, that becomes the really valuable information. All of the survival skills that I've learned are definitely from local people rather than from any sort of military training. It did pay. It really helped at the beginning, but I think it pays less and less significance over time.
Were you sort of learning Portuguese or Spanish at all leading up to this? Or did you just sort of turn up and sort of learn it a bit along the way?
I spoke basic Spanish before I started. I'd lived in Argentina for a year and a half, and I'd done a sort of month or two in Guatemala. I really, really broken present tense type Spanish. Cho, who was my Peruvian walking partner that I met after 5 months, that walked with me for 2 years, he would tell you that I spoke no Spanish at all when he met me. But I did speak a bit, obviously. So it was just learnt on the hoof, really. Most of my Spanish is learnt as a result of speaking to people, and so my grammar is absolutely terrible. But I'm now at the level where I can speak, and I'm not consciously translating. I'm just speaking, and equally I can hear it and understand it without having to translate it into English. And so it's a reasonable level. And what I did in the sort of 3 months or so before we crossed the Brazilian border is I'd got these little MP3 files on my MP3 player that were learning Portuguese, and so I'd sit in my hammock every night and do a little Portuguese lesson, so that when I got to the border, I had the basics. I had the sort of first 20 phrases and 100 words or whatever, just so that I was able to get by a little bit, and then actually my Portuguese never really improved that much, because I worked with Cho, the Peruvian guy, all the way through Brazil as well, and so we just spoke in Spanish. So my Spanish is all right, my Portuguese not so much.
So in terms of the actual planning leading up to sort of day one, how long did the actual planning phase of this expedition take?
Yeah, just over a year, mate. I think it was almost exactly New Year 2007 that I decided to do the expedition. That I literally went out with a mate. We were in Belize, and we were leading conservation expeditions for a charity, and me and another leader just decided, wouldn't it be cool to he actually had plans to kayak the Amazon, and I wanted to walk it, and I convinced him that walking it had never been done before, and if he managed to do that, he'd get a Guinness World Record. And so it wasn't very difficult to convince him it was a good idea. So we committed to doing it, and from that moment, I think it was April 2008 that we actually. So it's between 2007 and 2008 I was planning it, and I don't know. The vast majority of that was trying to get funds together. It isn't a difficult expedition logistically, and I often quite facetiously, sort of or flippantly, talk about, you just have to pack a rucksack, walk downhill, keep the river on your left hand side, and just keep going for 2 years. But it almost was that simple. There wasn't really much we could plan. I knew that so much would change along the way that as long as I got to the start line with a rucksack with the right equipment in it, or even if it was the wrong equipment, I could buy it along the way. I stood a good chance of doing it. And I think so. A lot of it got spent on fundraising and literally, sending those hundreds of blind emails out to companies and getting no responses whatsoever. And then eventually I was really lucky with the funding. I got a call from a mate saying he was going to do a shoot. It was actually a pheasant shoot, which is not really my scene normally, but I agreed to go and spend the day with lots of these rich businessmen from London. And one of them took me aside afterwards and just said, Ed, I was listening to what you've got planned and I'd really like to sponsor your entire expedition. So bizarrely, just a day off when I was not looking for funding. And I suppose invariably I was a bit more relaxed and so I wasn't pushing it, that somebody came and just agreed to pay for it. I mean, it ended up not paying for the whole thing, but it got me off the starting line. Yeah.
Well, a lot of people think that, a lot of people don't realise that, all the time and effort trying to get sponsorship that's sort of half the battle. Trying to, you're knocking on doors, trying to get sponsorship and just getting knockbacks all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's demoralising, definitely. I mean, I think when you're trying to, there were two things: the money and also the feedback that I was getting off people, because everybody was telling me it was impossible and that I was daft. And you've got the courage of your own convictions up to a point, but if the Royal Geographical Society are telling you that you'll die, if Ranulph Fiennes is telling you that you're going to die, you kind of start to doubt yourself. And and with not having any money, it was just like, well, where do I start? I'm the only one that thinks that this is possible, for one, and two, I don't have the money to even get the flights to go there, let alone the insurance and the satellite phone communications and et cetera, et cetera. So it was a bit of an uphill struggle, and I think, in a way, you're right. That was one of the things that I'm proud of the most, is sticking to it over that year and a half and plodding away, and eventually getting the initial bit of funding, which got us off the ground and got us running. So yeah, I think, did we do any physical training? No, absolutely none. We started with a couple of double chins each, and we'd been, pretty much sitting in London doing no exercise at all, and then went straight into tropical heat. In fact, it was desert conditions at the start, because obviously there's a rain shadow at the west of the Andes, and so we literally started on the Pacific coast in desert conditions, and we hadn't even really prepared for that. We'd got full Gore-Tex and everything that we needed, well, we thought we needed for the mountains and the jungle, but we hadn't even considered that there might be a desert part of the Amazon. So yeah, it was all a bit thrown together. It was all a bit last minute, but to be honest, those sort of trips end up being the best adventures, don't they? Because you've got to think on your feet and use your sort of wits to get you through it. So yeah, that's what we did.
So did you get heaps of like immunisation shots for malaria and all the other dengue fever and stuff like that? Did you sort of get immunised beforehand, or? Yeah,
all the standard ones. I mean, you can't get immunised for malaria; you have to take the tablets. But there's an antibiotic called doxycycline, and it's an antibiotic, but you can use it as an anti-malarial, and it's the only anti-malarial that they agreed you could take for up to 6 months. It was up to 6 months, and I took that for 2.5 years. So yeah, it was. We were covered medically. Yeah. Give us
an insight into your backpack, like. When you're in South America, you started off in where did you start off? Was it Peru?
Yeah, I started on the Pacific coast of Peru. Started with a ridiculous amount of weight, far too much weight. I literally had a South America bird guide. I had binoculars. I had like 5 sets of gloves. I had spare hats. I had a tent as well as a hammock. I had so much stuff, and it weighed about 48 kilos, the rucksack initially, which was just daft. I picked it up on the beach, and at the beginning of because I filmed the whole thing, at the beginning of the film, you just see me ripping the shoulder strap off my rucksack because it just came clean away from the rucksack, and they were brand new packs, but it was just far too heavy. And so we really suffered for the first week or two in the blistering heat, and then every villager that was kind to us or let us stay in their garden or something like that, we offloaded a bit of kit, and we just, over the course, streamlined it. I think, clearly we needed more kit for the mountains than we did for the jungle. But by the time we hit the jungle, my base kit without any without any food was about 32, 33 kilos, which is much more manageable. And so, it was just slimmed down over time. And, it was just the essentials. I say that it wasn't just the essentials because I'd committed to broadcasting the whole thing along the way. We had a BGAN, which is a broadband global internet thing, which at the time was quite cutting edge, but it was about the size of a laptop. I also did have a laptop, a MacBook Air, to make the whole thing work, and 2 video cameras. And basically the plan was to not just record it, but broadcast it live. So we would be uploading videos to Vimeo every week, and we managed to do a bit of that. I mean, I think I uploaded about 30 videos in the entire expedition. But as a result, I was carrying around not just the kit that I needed to survive, not just the hammocks and the sleeping bag, etc. I was obviously carrying around all the batteries and cables and electrical units that I needed to both film it and broadcast it as well.
So you actually started this, the actual expedition with another guy. How long were you two walking together for? Was it like a few months, was it?
Yeah, about 3 months before he got fed up with me. I don't know. We were very good mates. I mean, I was meant to be his best man at his wedding. Before we started the expedition, he was engaged. But, I think it was just like a bad marriage, everything. We just spent so much time in each other's pockets that, the slightest things would just really wind each other up. Like the way Luke would drink his coffee in the morning and couldn't speak to you until he's finished his coffee. It would just really fuck me off. And essentially, he was, I don't know, he's a really nice lad, but he struggled. I won't pretend that he didn't struggle. And I think if I'd been in a better place, I would have been able to help him. But I didn't. I just got frustrated that he was holding me back. And so it caused a bit of a divide. And I think he almost became a bit heartbroken, really, because he saw my opinion of him dropping. And he didn't like seeing that reflected in me. And so after 3 months, he just said, I've had enough. I'm not enjoying this. I've got a fiance back at home who loves me. I could be getting married, having an amazing life, and I'm not. I'm with you, who thinks I'm a piece of shit. And so, yeah, it was a bit. It was the one negative. It's the one regret of the whole expedition, if I'm honest. It was that, I mean, I've reached out to him a couple of times since the expedition and said, look, Luke, let's go for a beer. I want to put this behind us because, blokes do put things behind us, don't you? You very rarely hold things against people for very long. But it went quite deep with him, and he just said literally almost a one-line email saying, I never want to have anything to do with you ever again. So he's... it's. I think it must also hurt that the expedition went on to be quite big and quite publicised, and and he was part of it, and now he's not. So I just think he's sort of shut it. Fair enough, really, actually, but he's shut it out of his life. Yeah.
Can you tell us how you met? Who was the guy? Was it Cho? How did you meet him, and where? And tell us about when you sort of first met him, and like how far into the expedition were you time-wise before you met him? And
I had about 2 months of walking after Luke left, with different guides. Some of them indigenous Amerindians, like Ashaninkas, and it was fine, but there was no continuity to it. And I was in a very dangerous area called the Red Zone, which is the sort of drugs trafficking area of Peru. It's pretty lawless. Literally, the National Police Force of Peru can't enter. There'll be a big gun fight because the drug lords manage it, basically, the ronderos, as they're called. And it was quite scary, I have to admit. And there was no one consistent person that I was walking through. And I did meet this guy called Cho. I was introduced to him by an anthropologist, actually, that I met along the way, but that's another story. But he was introduced to me, and we sat down, and he reckoned that we got 5 days before we were out of the red zone, out of this dangerous area. So he agreed to walk with me for 5 days, and he was actually the perfect person to walk with because he'd, although he was a logger by trade, he'd done work for the drug traffickers, and he'd run base cocaine up and down the mountains, and so he knew the dangerous parts, and he knew the ones that weren't used by the drug traffickers. So it was almost invaluable. It was a bit annoying at first. He's an evangelical Christian as well, so he'd sing Christian songs at the top of his voice in Spanish, which I found really annoying, and he'd sort of shout out, "Ed, are you motivated?" which I also found really. But I think the thing was he had loads of confidence, and I couldn't I couldn't hide the fact that that was really helping me. I was quite a paranoid wreck by that point. So after 5 days, we got out of the red zone, the dangerous bit, and he said, "Look, Ed, I'm really enjoying this. If you want, I'll walk with you to the next town," which was about 10 days further walk away, which he did. And then at that town, he said, "Look, Ed, I'm still really enjoying that. If you want, I'll walk with you all the way to the mouth of the Amazon." So he literally never went home. He packed his bags for 5 days and walked for 2 years, which was quite extraordinary, really. Yeah, he actually became. He has become a really good friend, almost like a brother. He's been over here twice. He lived with my mum up in Leicestershire. Played rugby for my local rugby club. Broke his hand playing rugby as well for them, and absolutely loves it over here. The end of season dinner, he got overseas player of the year at our rugby club, which was quite nice. But an absolute legend, and without him, it's very possible that I wouldn't have been able to achieve the whole thing. He was brilliant. Yeah.
So I'm just trying to get my head around, walking, like you mentioned before, sort of keep the Amazon River to your left and just sort of keep walking for 2.5 years. How did you end up sort of navigating? Was that, I'm guessing there's going to be heaps of times where keeping the river to your left wasn't really feasible, and did you have to sort of venture right in?
It was a bit of a throwaway line, I have to admit. It's I'm slightly being self-mocking by saying, look, it's easy, keep the river on the left and keep walking downhill. Yes, what I mean by that is it was very rough navigation, and you didn't have to be very good at navigating in order to do it. It's following a fucking huge river, and it didn't matter whether I was on the left or the right. I just had to follow the river, and if you'd gone in and out of all of the little meanders and stayed like for a start, you need to understand that the Amazon River is so flat, and the Amazon flood basin is so flat that twice a year, it basically once a year, every flood season it floods, but to the extent of perhaps 80 kilometers away from the main channel. So you get this huge area called flooded forest. So it has no distinct banks, and so that's why everyone thought that it was impossible, because there's these huge areas of varzea or flooded forest, which is just basically underwater. And so what I think the reason that the expedition became possible is online. I saw these before I left. I saw these maps that were accredited to NASA, which appeared to show the extent of the floodwaters underneath the jungle canopy. And so I wrote to NASA, and they were amazing, actually. Within like 3 days, this bundle of CD-ROMs came through the post, and basically they'd done this experiment which looked through the jungle canopy, and I think it was using sort of refraction or something like that, but it basically mapped the whole of the Amazon at peak floodwaters, which meant that I could then annotate my maps with this new line which showed where the hard ground was. And that's when the expedition suddenly became possible in my mind, because I was like, the reason everyone thinks this is impossible is because this information isn't out there. Nobody knows where it's going to be flooded and where it's not. But I suddenly did know where it was flooded and where it's not. I mean, it was data from 1996, but, largely the topography of a country doesn't change, does it? So, the peak floodwater area is going to be roughly the same. So it helped hugely, and it changed the whole expedition. So I then used that to essentially plot a line on the map which handrailed the Amazon. But as I said, at times when we were at peak flood season, it was 80 kilometers away from the main channel, and it was just a case of trying to keep on hard ground. Clearly, all of the tributaries that run into the Amazon that I was cross-graining, they've all got their associated flooded forest as well. So there were points where I couldn't help it. You were literally walking through flooded areas where, you're normally walking through a jungle if there's not a path in front of you, using a machete to cut through all the razor grass and the vines and et cetera, et cetera. But you'd have to continue doing that underwater, which was just the most ridiculous thing, with, the spikes on the trees going into your kneecaps, and it was quite ridiculous. And then if it got above head height, I'd inflate these little inflatable pack rafts, and we would kneel in the front of the pack raft and then carry on chopping through. So it was farcical at times, utterly farcical. And, it was a completely nonsensical way of navigating the river. You'd just go by boat, especially because we were carrying little inflatable pack rafts in our pack. We had the means to just inflate them and go down the river, but that wasn't the mission. And we even had a little rule that if we crossed the river, we would walk back to perpendicular to where we set off, so that we couldn't be accused of floating down the river at all when we crossed over it. And the first time I did that, we walked back, I don't know, 80 meters or something to correct the amount we'd floated down. But the last time we did it, at the end, the last time we crossed the Amazon, it took 10 days to walk back to perpendicular to where we set off from. So we were really strict, and I suppose that's why Guinness gave us the world record, because we'd gone the extra mile and quite literally, and made sure that we'd walked every single meter of the river. Yeah.
Did you carry any weapons at all? Like you had the machete. Did you carry a gun at all? For hunting or?
I considered it. For hunting, it would have been great. And I'm not sure it would have been good for security, but essentially my take on it was that it would escalate things. If we got into trouble, and we did, come face to face with drugs traffickers who shoved shotguns in our chests, and when we came face to face with indigenous tribes that were really fucking angry that we were there as well. And I think if I'd been armed, I was alarming people enough anyway, as it was. As a 6'1" white man with a skinhead, I was a scary sight, because they'd never seen a white person walk out of the jungle before. Some of them had seen white people like missionaries, and obviously they'd gone to town to buy rice and stuff. They've seen tourists, but I suppose the thing was that if I felt that if I was armed, it would escalate situations and make people more scared and then get me in more trouble. I thought it was far better to rely on being humble, being a bit stupid, actually, just literally trying to rely on making a connection with people and being as non-threatening as possible. And I think it was the right thing to do. I'd been out in Afghanistan before as a consultant with the UN, and we were unarmed during the first presidential elections, and a couple of guys got scared and they decided to arm themselves, and then they got stopped at an illegal checkpoint and they got themselves killed. But it was only because they were armed, and it was that little story really that made me think, I don't want to arm myself. I need to be as non-threatening as possible.
And how did you sort of deal with the drug traffickers? How did you sort of get out of that situation? Did you have to pay them off, or did you just sort of go the friendly approach? Or
yeah, I mean, I didn't. Bizarrely, for South America, I didn't pay a single bribe on the whole expedition. I think I always have relied on, if you smile too much, if you're too friendly, people can think that you're not taking them seriously. And when there's somebody in a position of authority that is angry that you're there and you start smiling, it can be really seen as taking the mickey. And I didn't want to do that, so it was quite sensitive. And I think I always just tried to read the situation as carefully as possible, sort of show respect, show that I was, a little bit fearful of them. Maybe, I mean, it's just that balance, isn't it? Certainly respectful, maybe not fearful, confident enough that they can't do whatever they like, but respectful enough that I'm actually listening to them and taking them seriously. And it was just that delicate balance, and it did seem to work the whole way through. I was completely not a threat. I was just a tourist as far as anyone was concerned. The one problem where I did come into was the video camera, because obviously it's all very illegal activities going on, and so I was quite surprised on a couple of occasions that they didn't take the cameras. But I was lucky. Maybe I think I can only put it down to luck. And then also you have to bear in mind that I hired different people along the route, so I always had a local person who could do a bit of talking on my behalf. So Cho became the person that did 2 years with me. But still, when we entered Brazil, when we went through sort of tribal areas, we'd hire a Takuna local man, because he'd know the local paths, and he'd also, when we walked into villages, he'd be the first person to walk in. So it was less threatening. It was less what's the right word? It was there was just a way of putting somebody in place that wasn't going to shock people, so that they could explain who we were. And some of the time, because we were hiring local guides, and they'd come into a village and they hadn't seen their cousins for 2 years or something, they'd throw a big party, and we'd all end up getting horrendously drunk in the middle of the jungle on some sort of weird homegrown wine or spirits or whatever, and then have to get up the next morning with hangovers and start walking again. So it was definitely the way to do it. I think if I tried to bash through the jungle on my own as a white person, I could have physically potentially done it, but I think I would have ended up getting killed, because of people would have just been scared of me. And that sounds melodramatic, but it's not at all. All of these people, certainly in Peru, have seen a lot of bloodshed during their lives, during the time of the Shining Path, the sort of communist guerrillas that swept through Peru in the 80s and 90s. They, had huge warring going on in these little jungle villages, and they'd all seen bloodshed, and they'd all seen people being killed, and so they're very, very defensive of their land. And so I had to be very, very aware that these people wouldn't put up with people coming into their land and not being respectful. So I thought that on top of the information I got for NASA about the flooded forest, I think that was the next key thing that got me through the whole thing, was just hiring local guides, not being afraid to take on board local knowledge. I think that was one of the key reasons that I got through it as well.
What are the in the red zone, are the coca plantations, are they quite prominent? Are they just everywhere?
It's getting less. Yeah, I mean, we were coming out of the really bad times. I mean, 80s and 90s were worst. The Shining Path didn't really exist when I walked through. They'd become drugs traffickers. They were this communist idealist movement, but they'd become just sort of rebels, drugs traffickers, really. Yes, you saw lots of coca being grown. Yes, but then again, that is a local custom. People chew coca leaf anyway, just as a non-illegal pastime. But yeah, we saw evidence of processing plants and stuff, and we were told before the expedition, if you stumble across a processing plant, that's active, you'll just disappear. No one will ever see you again. And we stumbled across a few that had been abandoned, but we were fortunate enough never to actually stumble into one that was in full swing. So maybe that was luck. I don't know. Or maybe the guides that I were walking with different sections steered me clear of them without me even realizing. It was that probably was much more of a danger, more of a death threat than the actual inherent dangers of the jungle, like snakes and jaguars and stuff like that. It was the people that was always the big problem. Yeah.
What was was there a particular animal or that really annoyed you? Well, I'm sort of thinking mozzies or ants. Was it like really the small stuff that really got to you at all? Or
yeah, I mean, they did invariably. There was ants on lots of the trees, and sometimes you'd go under a tree, and my pack was quite high, and so you'd dislodge a bit of an ant's nest, and all the ants would go down the back of your neck, and it would be extraordinarily frustrating. And the mozzies, sometimes when Luke left, for some reason he took all of the mozzie repellent. So for about 3 months, I walked through Peru along the river without any mozzie repellent, and I just remember I'd look down at my hands in some of the worst areas, and you know when you look at your hand and there's like 7 mosquitoes biting one hand, and you think, fuck, if 7 of them are biting that one hand at the moment, I'm probably getting bitten 20 times currently. If you times that by the amount of time that I'm walking through a whole day, it's like the amount of mosquito bites was almost immeasurable. And it was quite interesting to note that when I started the expedition, I'd come out in the usual red bumps, but after about 3 months, my body became like a local. Actually, I just didn't react at all. I think my body had just decided that it was immune now, or that it didn't. There was no point in doing a sort of allergic reaction to these mosquito bites, and so I still to this day don't. They're not even bothered by mosquitoes now. They don't have any effect on me. But and then there were bees, because we were off trail a lot of the time. Bees and wasps lay their nests on the underside of leaves, and because we were cutting through the vegetation, the man at the front was the one that would always get hit by a swarm of bees, and sometimes get sort of 30 or 40 stings. But they were, I don't know, it's weird how we developed this sort of black sense of humor. Obviously, the people behind, the one that got hit would shout out abejas or avispas, depending on what it was, and the others would just literally laugh and run into the bushes and put their heads down. But the one at the front would always get hit 20 or 30 times with stings, and I don't know, it was excruciatingly painful, but the only way we could work out to deal with it was just to laugh at the person who had been unlucky enough to be at the front. So it was quite a sort of laddish sense of humour, but it just became hilarious. And if you hit three bees nests in a day, then it was really difficult to maintain your sense of humor. I remember doing that 3 times in one day and hitting the third one and getting about the 100th sting and just screaming at the jungle. Literally lost my sense of humor completely and just screaming at the jungle because I was so annoyed. But yeah, that wasn't every day.
Did you come across any sort of local natives, like tribes, like, you guys would have been walking along and sort of did you randomly, stumble across villages or other Indians or natives sort of just roaming the jungle?
Yes. I mean, the whole journey was contact after contact with indigenous tribes. We went Ashaninka Indians, Shipibo Indians, Tikuna. The tribes, although each one of those tribes has hundreds of villages, but yeah, the essence of the whole expedition was almost hopping between these settlements because yes, sometimes you met people out on the trails, sometimes you met people out hunting, and sometimes people were scared of us and sometimes they weren't, is the honest answer. Often if it was women that we met alone, they were terrified and they'd scream and run away, or sometimes the men would show this sort of overt display of sort of aggression and bring their bows and arrows up and point them at us and stuff, but that was because they were scared, I think. And a lot of the expedition, as I said before, it wasn't just the drugs traffickers. It was convincing these indigenous guys that I wasn't a threat at all. And they would sometimes get really angry because a lot of them are illiterate. They can't read or write. So our permits meant absolutely nothing to them. It was just a load of nonsense written down on a piece of paper. And so because they consider themselves autonomous and, the tribal chief is the ruler of his land, he doesn't understand that Peru is a country, let alone that, that people from Lima aren't foreigners. And so to him, I am just a threat from the outside, and I might have a piece of paper, but, it means absolutely nothing. So quite often the danger would be that these guys would be really justifiably angry because I've walked into their territory and they don't have a clue who I am. That's why I said that hiring the local guides was really, really important, because it just allowed there to be somebody who'd walked with me for maybe 2 or 3 days that already knew me, that, had shared a little bit of a giggle over supper the night before, and therefore was able to defend my character a little bit. But yeah, it was, I do look back on my notes, and I was definitely depressed because I wrote a book about it, and, I was definitely depressed because I was so scared the whole time. I don't think you can be scared for 9 months or so of Peru every day and it not take a little bit of a toll on you. It does take a huge toll. And I remember some of the notebooks are just like streamed where the pages have got wet, but it's from my tears. I've just literally been in my hammock at night crying because I suppose because I've been trying to hold it together for so long, and then the only place where I feel it's safe to actually let go is in my hammock. And I just remember crying, literally sobbing hard in my hammock some nights while trying to write down what was happening during the days. But I think, it sounds horrendous, and at times it was pretty horrendous. But I don't have any negative feelings towards these people because they have gone through huge atrocities themselves. These indigenous guys are defensive of their land for a reason, because they've lived through a period where people were pushing them off their land to try and grow coca to obviously make cocaine, and they've suffered hugely. So I think as soon as I started to understand the story more, I started to feel a lot more empathy towards these guys, and it was just a case of being humble, trying to make them realize that I wasn't a threat at all, and then invariably they were lovely people. They just have to live in a bit like a wild animal. You have to be defensive in order to protect yourself and protect your family if you live in those sort of conditions. So, and that's what they were doing.
So did you spend like any time based at like in a village at all? Like a couple weeks at a particular village, or not really?
Not in the villages. Just before we got to the Colombian border, we stopped in a town called Iquitos, because Cho didn't have a passport because he'd never left the country before. So we had to send his paperwork off to Lima, and we ended up stopping in Iquitos for 3 weeks but that was a perfect time for us because by that point we'd been walking for about 8 months already, and we were exhausted. And it was Christmas time, and my birthday's on Boxing Day as well. So this guy heard about us on the local radio and decided to take us in. So he let us stay at his house for about 3 weeks, and literally we just relaxed over Christmas, and it was lovely. It was such an antithesis from the actual expedition. You know, 3 or 4 days ago we'd been up to our chest in swamps and being bitten by ants and mosquitoes and all that, and then we found ourselves, sitting in this nice house, drinking beer, chatting to this guy who spoke fluent English, and it just seemed a completely different world. And that happened again in Tabatinga. I had to, because all my cameras broke, I had to get new cameras sent through. And if anyone ever wants to get things imported into Colombia, I would recommend somebody bring them in by hand rather than sending them in through DHL, because that took another, I think, 2.5 weeks. So that was another enforced break. And then in Tabatinga, I had another 2-week break, but literally within the town, not leaving the route at all. But in the little villages, it was literally find somewhere to stay, sleep that night, and then get up the next morning and continue the walk.
Typically, along the route, give us like an overview of like a typical night. Did you guys sort of create a little campsite type thing, or where did you sleep?
The expedition sort of became more and more refined as we went on, and for the last, I would say, 6 months, Joe and I walked on our own. We didn't hire local guides because we didn't need them anymore, and we became very efficient. And we'd both got a hammock each, and they were just these big droopy parachute silk hammocks, but with an external mosquito net and then a tarpaulin or a basher over the top of that. And so we'd, at about 4 o'clock, maybe 3:30, 4 o'clock each day, we'd decide that we were absolutely exhausted and find some water. We'd both put our hammocks up. Joe would go off to fish, and I would find firewood and make a fire. And we also had another tarpaulin to put over the fire. And then he'd come back with hopefully some fish, and I'd have the fire made. And then once we'd got the food on cooking, we'd both go down to the water and wash, and we'd wash all of our bodies, but we'd also wash all the clothes that we'd been wearing during the day. We'd only got one set of clothes that we'd wear during the day, and that got washed every day, literally. And then we'd change we'd got a dry pair of shorts basically, and a pair of what they call Crocs that we'd wear in the evening, and we'd go back to the fire where the food was cooking. We'd hang our clean wet clothes over the fire, and there's a little essentially a paracord line underneath the tarpaulin over the fire that we'd put our wet clothes on, and then we'd go to bed. We'd eat supper, which would normally be sort of rice and beans, and if Joe had caught any fish, then it would be obviously fish as well. And then we'd go to sleep, and we'd be in bed by about 7 or 8 in the evenings, and have loads of time in a hammock. So it would often be reading books. I read so many books on that trip, or listening to MP3 player. Powder your feet with antifungal foot powder, and then our feet had then almost 12 hours to dry out each evening. Certainly about 10 hours to dry out each evening, and to not get immersion foot. Then we'd wake up in the morning, make breakfast, but also make lunch. So we'd carry a little Tupperware box with a lock and lock lid. So we'd make twice as much food as we needed for breakfast, so that we got sort of rice and beans, maybe a bit of fish for lunch in a Tupperware box. And we'd walk during the days from about 8 in the morning till about 4 in the afternoon. So about 8 hours of walking, and we'd always break for 10 minutes in every hour, because on the hour, every hour, we'd stop until 10 past, and then one of us would walk up front cutting for 25 minutes, and then we'd swap round, and the other one would walk for 25 minutes, and then by then it would be the end of the hour. So it was a system that became incredibly slick and worked really, really well, and we sort of played to our own strengths. Joe loved fishing. I liked making fires. I was quite happy with that sort of distinction of what we did, and it also meant that we weren't sort of, I don't know, we just allowed each other to sort of exist in their own little space. It was it was amazing to find someone that I didn't clash with for that length of time, walking with someone for 2 years. And I'm not an easy character to get on with sometimes. And somehow we managed to find a way. He wasn't at all controlling Joe. He was literally there to sort of facilitate the whole expedition being done, and I'm extraordinarily grateful to have found somebody who was as I don't know, self-aware and understanding, and yeah, it wasn't just his physical skills; it was his mindset was extraordinarily calm and balanced. And whereas I would go up and down, volatility. My mind state would be quite volatile. Sometimes I'd get angry at things if I was wasting time. Sometimes I'd get down. Cho was quite, he was a bit of a rock, and he would always stay quite calm. He'd always deal with situations well. I was very, very lucky to find him.
During the day or even at night, were you ever fearful, or were you always sort of on the lookout for jaguars at all, or other animals or creatures that could, potentially end this expedition or even end your life? Like snakes and stuff like that? G'day guys, Matt here. This podcast is a labour of love, and all episodes are researched, scheduled, edited, created and promoted in my spare time. Typically, after an episode has been recorded, it can take another 3 hours of post-production activities to get the final cut. If I'm providing you with value and you wish to support my vision of sharing these inspirational stories to the world, you can do so at borntokickarse.com and click on the Patreon banner. Your support will help to maintain the monthly podcast running costs and enable me to outsource repetitive tasks so I can bring you even more kick-ass episodes. Once again, if you want to support me in producing this podcast, head over to borntokickarse.com and click on the Patreon banner. You can't miss it. And now back to the rest of the show. During the day or even at night, were you ever fearful, or were you always sort of on the lookout for jaguars at all, or other animals or creatures that could, potentially end this expedition or even end your life? Like snakes and stuff like that?
I think we both, I think snakes were definitely a real threat, but that was having to be aware. Obviously, most of the snakes are sort of semi-arboreal out there, so they live up in the trees as well as on the floor. So we were just having to be careful because obviously we weren't walking down paths, and we were chopping through vines. We were having to be careful above the ground as well as on the floor. In certain areas, we were seeing sort of 4 or 5 snakes a day, and mostly vipers. In other areas, you go 3 weeks without seeing a snake. We never saw a jaguar. We always maintained that we were just making too much noise. We were too overt. In the day, we were crashing through the jungle at high speed, and at night time, we'd got a big fire going, and we'd cleared big area around our bashers and around the fire with the machetes, so that it was quite a sort of sanitized little area wherever we made our camp. And we just thought that jaguars were too timid we were too big to really be a proper food option for a jaguar. And yes, of course they could be lethal, but I think you'd have to take them by surprise, or they'd have to have young that you got in the way of, or something like that, for them to be a real threat. And we always thought we'd be really lucky to even see the glimpse of a jaguar, and in fact the case was that we didn't see one the whole time. We saw their prints, we could hear them calling at night sometimes, but we never saw one in 2.5 years. So I think bizarrely, one of the biggest things that I became fearful of was in the flooded forest were electric eels, because they can grow up to about 2 meters long, and they're apex predators, which means that nothing hunts them. So they don't sort of like fish. They don't sort of dart away when you disturb the water. They just sit there, and they can deliver, I forget what the voltage is, but enough of an electric shock to knock you out, and you end up dying by drowning, basically. But they're really, really quite aggressive. And that they've been known to kill horses that have gone into little puddles that have been formed in the jungle. So they were there, they were out there. But I mean, in general, things tended to keep themselves to themselves. The locals thought we were crazy for walking without a shotgun, but I always maintained that it had to be that way because of reducing how aggressive we looked when we walked into a village. I mean, it would have changed the feel of everything. If I walked in armed with a shotgun, it would have just changed everything.
That'd be full on.
Ridiculously so. I mean, if I walked into your house with a shotgun, you're just going to immediately react to me differently, aren't you? So it was the right decision, I think.
What were some of the villagers' reactions when they found out that you both of you guys were, walking the entire length of the Amazon River? Were they just, what was the look on their face when they sort of found that, they were trying to process the fact that you're walking 7,000 kilometres?
Certain people got it and certain people just didn't understand it at all. You'd say it to some people and they'd say, oh yeah, and then they'd carry on the conversation about something else. And I think it didn't compute to a lot of people. A lot of the indigenous guys certainly have never seen a map. They only really know their village and the river and maybe a few villages upstream and a few villages downstream. And they might have heard of some people from the other side of the mountain range, but they don't understand the concept of Peru or South America or the Atlantic or any of that. So it didn't make sense to them, obviously. When we crossed the border into Brazil, actually, the villagers were more educated. I think the Brazilian government has obviously invested more money into the villages. And, although the tribal chiefs still had jaguar tooths on their necklaces, they also had USB pen drives, and each village had a little internet sort of hub in the school, and they were far more aware of the rest of the world. And I think those villages were very much more welcoming, actually, because they weren't scared of us, I think. And almost immediately, every time we walked into a Brazilian village, almost immediately this plate of food would just appear out of nowhere and get put in front of us, and we'd be forced to eat almost before we've told people our names or what we were doing. And they were fascinated in what we were doing. And Brazilians are incredibly proud of the Amazon, because they kind of feel like it's their rainforest, because the majority of it is in there. And I think they were just really pleased that somebody had decided to come halfway around the world and walk through their rainforest. And it became something. And obviously, the closer you get to the mouth of the Amazon, you've got huge cattle ranches, you've got metropolises, you've got very, 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 very cultured Western people, and of course they got it completely, and largely we're very supportive, I have to say. Yeah.
Was there a particular point on the actual expedition that you were at your lowest and you were really contemplating pulling the plug on the whole thing?
As I said, I got depressed definitely on a lot of sections. It wasn't the most complicated of strategies, but I just pictured myself walking back into my local pub in Leicestershire in England and admitting to my friends that I'd come back early and I hadn't done the expedition, and I could see them all patting me on the back, sort of saying, "Oh, we don't think any less of you, Ed. Don't worry about it." And of course, they would have thought far less of me, and I just could never let that happen. And every time I thought about going home, because I wanted to go home so many times, I just thought, I can't let that happen. I've shouted about this quite loud. I've got a big website. I've claimed that I'm going to, do this thing and make this book and this TV program. And because I've said I'm going to do it, I've got to do it. And it's not very high level planning. But I remember my dad always used to say, if I went and got drunk on a Friday night and I'd committed to playing rugby on a Saturday, initially I'd be like, "Oh, I don't want to go and play, Dad." And he's like, "You've got to play because you've said you'll play, and if you don't go, you're letting the team down." And it was just that, really. It was just like, I've said I'll do this, so I've kind of got to do it. And I think, for that reason, through nothing more complicated than that, it just each time it came up, I just had to dismiss it and just keep going.
Do you remember the final day? You've been walking for 2.5 years. Across the South American continent. Do you remember the last day that you saw the Atlantic Ocean?
Yeah, of course I did. Until quite recently, that was definitely the best day of my life. I've since got married and had a little boy, so it's weird how I think it's just a different kind of day. I think having my first child is now the best day of my life. But at the time it was that, and walking for 2.5 years, doing an expedition that everyone thought was impossible, and then there was almost a sense of fuck you, if you know what I mean. All of the people who were naysayers, all of the people that said I was going to die, all of the people that laughed at me, it was almost a sort of two-fingered salute. I felt like, to be able to stand on that beach and say, we've done it. You were wrong, we were right. It's almost childishly stroppy, but I'd had to soak up so much negativity in order to get to the end that I almost felt like standing on the screen on the beach and just telling everyone where to go, but I mean, at one point I definitely shed a little tear. It was just all the emotions coming together. I think I'd walked that last day. We'd had to walk all the way through the evening, all the way through the night to get to the beach on time because we got our flights booked and stuff, and we were absolutely exhausted. We hadn't slept for a couple of days by the time we arrived, and this all the emotions of, I think, holding it together. I think for that amount of time, not really, well, not seeing any family or friends, or not doing anything just for fun, but just being focused on this one mammoth task for so long. It all came to a head, and I thought I got frustrated at first walking, and I started getting annoyed with the people around me, and then as we ran into the sea, it was just, the tears came, and it was undeniably the best day of my life. That feeling of accomplishment, I don't think I'll probably ever quite match that.
It's an incredible feat that you've done. Since the Amazon expedition, you've also featured in a number of sort of TV documentary series as well on the Discovery Channel. How did that sort of come about? Did the Discovery guys contact you shortly after you'd completed this expedition?
Well, I took cameras with me in order to film the expedition, but I didn't have a commission from a broadcaster. So I came back with 180 hours of footage, which isn't actually that much for 2.5 years. But through a production company, I approached Discovery Channel, and they commissioned it, and it made 2 one-hour shows, and it rated really well. Got a lot of viewers, and so they said, "Okay, Ed, we'd like you to make another one." And I was like, "I'm not going off for another 2.5 years to make another TV program, to make 2 hours of TV." And so they said, well, "Okay, let's find a project that you can do for us, which takes 2 months." And we went through a lot of different ideas, and the one that came out was, if you were dropped off on a desert island with no food, no water, no knife, no clothes, literally nothing to help you survive, start bolt naked with an emergency satellite phone and the camera equipment to film yourself, do you think you'd not only be able to survive, do you think you'd be able to thrive? Do you think you'd be able to sort of, build a little hut, Robinson Crusoe style, and hunt and fish and blah blah blah? And so my answer was, I don't know. I've never done that before. So they thought, brilliant. Okay, we need this to be really quite difficult a challenge because it's a shorter period of time. That's why they took. I didn't have any help from outsiders. I didn't have a camera crew. It was literally just me on that island. And bizarrely, that ended up being even harder than the Amazon. It was. I didn't recognize how much I'd relied on Cho and on just having somebody else around me, and the enormity of being isolated for 60 days really, really hit hard. And so I set myself this ridiculous challenge to be thriving by the end of the 60 days. And I was fighting between going mad and staying sane. I was on the brink at some points, and yet it was the most amazing thing to have gone through, because I think when you are on your own, there's nowhere to hide, is there? You can't sort of make a sort of self-derogatory joke, or you can't sort of have a cigarette, or you can't have a beer, or you can't go on Facebook. And I had to literally sort of, I don't know, I have a self-awareness that I'd never had before, because you've got so much time with yourself. And so I came through that, and it actually made not as positive a program as they'd been hoping, but an extremely intense 3-part series for Discovery Channel. But it did extraordinarily well in the ratings, and so they said, okay, well, you've done that now, we want you to do a spin-off series. And so I ended up starting to make this series that became known as Marooned, where basically I got dropped off for 10 days in different countries all over the world, and make survival shows, and it's been a dream come true, if I'm honest. It's no longer this life and death real expedition. It's, to an extent, it's fabricated. They're artificial situations. The locations are picked by a production team, and then I'm dropped in areas, and they know that somewhere there'll be water, and that it's been scouted beforehand. But what's nice is that they still allow me to just do what I do. So I get dropped in, and I've got my own camera, and I film myself, and I've literally got to find water, make a shelter, find food, and keep myself alive for 10 days. And it's taken its toll. I think the first series I was on antibiotics for 8 out of the 9 episodes when I came out, because of drinking dodgy water and picking up diseases and stuff like that. But crikey, I wouldn't change it for the world. I think this walking the Amazon opened a door to almost an adventurer's dream job, which is having your own show with your name in the title on Discovery Channel. And crikey, as much as I do sometimes complain about it, I do count my lucky stars that I'm in this amazing position. And it's not the sort of thing I could go into talk about at the Royal Geographical Society. It's entertainment TV now, but it's still good fun, and it still allows me to go to remote and wonderful places all over the world. I mean, this last series I've been to Mongolia, I've been to the Atacama Desert, I've been to the Darien Gap, I've been all over the world, and so it's amazing. It's still going, and I've done 7 series for them now, and the 8th one is about to be commissioned. So yeah, touch wood, it continues. Yeah.
I remember seeing a clip of you on YouTube where I'm not sure what series it was. I think it might have been the Naked and Marooned one, but you had to kill a goat. There was like a goat caught in some vines, like its horns and neck and stuff were caught up, and you had to kill it to eat it. What was that like? Like, I've never killed an animal with my own hands to eat. What's it like sort of going through that process, getting an animal, killing it, skinning it, gutting it, and eating it? What's that sort of process like?
Well, at the time, it was definitely the biggest animal I'd ever killed. The thing is, that was about day 42. I was so hungry, and I'd been hunting those goats for the past couple of weeks, but to no avail. I just failed. I'd make really crappy spears that were rubbish and didn't fly properly, or I'd make a bow and arrow that didn't work properly, and I'd failed. And so the luck of chancing upon one that had got itself tangled up in these vines was just too good to be true. So I literally knew that I had to dispatch it as quickly as possible. But as much as the TV show shows one strike to the head with a clamshell and the thing was dead, I mean, it took me 15 minutes of smashing this thing on the head with a clamshell to kill it, and it was gruesome, and it was quite raw and quite animalistic, and crikey, I would never have done it if it hadn't been for survival and for eating. But I didn't have a knife. I didn't have any way of dispatching it quicker, and I just literally thought just smash it on the head. But yeah, it took 15 minutes to kill it. So it was far more horrific than it actually even looked on the TV program. But I mean, I think because I knew that I needed to eat it, and crikey, I processed every bit of that goat, and I used the hide to sleep on at night to keep me warm, and I ate all of the meat, every single bit of it, none of it, which I'm quite proud about, none of it, even though it was a tropical island and it potentially could have got infested and fly with maggots and stuff. All of it got processed and cured and either cooked to eat that day or processed into goat jerky that I could then eat over the course of the next 10 days. But all of the meat got eaten. So yeah, I mean, it was an absolute godsend. But I think it was very, very matter of fact. There was none of that sort of pride of trophy hunting where you feel like you need to take a photo of yourself next to the dead carcass. It was purely a functional thing to get food inside me, and it didn't feel wrong because of that. If I went on an elephant safari and shot an elephant, I don't think I'd be able to live with myself. It would be a horrific thing, and I don't believe in that sort of trophy hunting. But it didn't feel wrong to kill something for its meat, and for it felt like this was a very natural thing to do, and that something that I would have done had I lived in centuries and centuries ago. Yeah,
I remember I was watching some more videos of you on YouTube, And it was actually quite funny. There's actually quite a few clips on there where I'm not really sure of the language, but there's another language dubbed on top of you. Like you'd be sort of, I think it was like official footage from maybe Discovery, and you're sort of talking to the camera, but there's like another guy in another language. I wasn't sure what language it was, but he's sort of dubbing his voice over you. It was quite interesting to see.
Yeah, it's because I mean the show plays in something like 240 territories all over the world. So yeah, I mean in Scandinavia and certain countries where people's English is good enough, it gets played in English with my voice and it has subtitles. But the rest of the world, yeah, they dub it.
So how would you sort of compare your survival skills today? Like either getting water or creating a fire or getting food, like today versus the Ed Stafford on day one of the Amazon expedition?
Incomparable, absolutely incomparable. I bizarrely, and I think I didn't necessarily want to bring up Bear Grylls in this program, in this podcast, but I will, because everyone has taken huge knocks out of Bear Grylls, and the fact that he didn't have that much survival experience when he started doing his shows, but through going through the shows, you actually do learn a hell of a lot. And 2.5 years in the Amazon, I learned a hell of a lot. But equally, being immersed in these TV shows and being put in situations where for 10 days you've just got to do whatever you do to survive and to eat, and if you don't, you're not going to die, but you're going to have to end the show because you won't have eaten and you won't be able to film. And so I've learned a huge amount, and I think there's every chance that I'm over the next year or two going to start a bit of a bushcraft school or a adventure academy or something, and I'd really love to do that because there's so many skills that I've learned now over the past 12 years or so, that certainly I do lessons for kids and stuff, but normally for my mates' kids' schools and stuff like that, and I love doing it because you just see the look of excitement on a kid's face where he's got a fire going without using a lighter or something like that, and they're really nice skills, I think, to have up your sleeve to just be able to teach. And so absolutely different ballpark between then and now. I've learned a lot.
Did you ever get into any ayahuasca ceremonies at all in Brazil or Peru?
Not while I was walking, no. I just deemed the expedition to be difficult enough to hold together without taking hallucinogenic drugs. However, I respect those that plant medicine and the ceremonies, and I have since been back to the Amazon. I've done, I think, in total about 20 nights of ayahuasca, and value it hugely in terms of its healing properties. I think a number of things that I've had in my life, from adoption at the beginning of my life to bizarrely to the isolation on the island, have taken their toll, and I found ayahuasca being an extraordinarily helpful tool to process, really, to get rid of negative stuff that was held within me. A lot of it involves purging, being sick, and defecating as well, but literally getting rid of negative stuff physically out of your body, and it almost feels like you're throwing up energetically, you're throwing negative energy out of your body, and it's been a really powerful thing for me. So yeah, I've been back and done it, but at a time when I didn't need to go and walk the next day and hold an expedition together, because it just at the time it wasn't the right time.
Yeah, so your TEDx talk as well, that's done almost 8 million views. That was a pretty good talk as well.
Right. Is it really?
Yeah,
8 million views?
Yeah.
Wow.
I think it's like 7.9 or 8, something like that. But yeah, and sorry?
That's my top rating video ever, and they're normally about 8,000 or something.
And yeah, you've got a couple books out, Walking the Amazon and also Naked and Marooned.
Yeah.
So, yeah, well, I just wanted to say thanks for coming on to the podcast. And whereabouts can people find you online and, sort of find out more about the Walking the Amazon expedition and, reach out and see what you're up to?
Oh, well, everything, you can find everything from my website. My website is literally edstafford.org, and that's got links to all social media and stuff like that. Not even that complicated these days with Google. Just type in Ed Stafford and it's all there. Now,
just before we go, you said you've got a new son.
I have, yeah.
Are you gonna teach him some survival skills? As he gets older.
Yeah, almost. He will live. We're fortunate enough now to have a lovely house with a bit of land and a little wood at the bottom of the garden and a stream running through it, and we've got areas to, build shelters and light fires and stuff like that. So he's going to have a good upbringing, and but I don't want to wrap him in cotton wool. I think it's weird. Over the last month or two, I felt this almost unstoppable wave of trying to protect him, and I've literally had to dig deep and work out what that was. And I think there's an instinct that kicks in with a dad that they want to, really, really protect the people who are dependents on them. But I want to make sure that even though that instinct has kicked in, that I let him live the sort of fullest and most immersive life that he really can. I want him to learn from his own mistakes. I want him to allow myself to give him enough space to really, really live. And I hate it when you see kids that aren't allowed to play and do sort of slightly risky play as well. So he should have a really good life, I think. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again for coming on, and I'll keep an eye out for the hopefully the next series of your adventures.
Yeah, the next series is called Left for Dead.
All right. Yeah. Cool. All right.
Yeah. So Matthew, thank you very much indeed.
No worries. Thanks, Ed. Okay. Cheers.
Cheers.
You've just been listening to the Born to Kick Arse podcast at borntoKickArse.com. If you liked what you heard and want more, please subscribe on iTunes. Give a 5-star rating and a Kick Arse review. This really helps to boost our presence and continues to allow us to introduce you to the most fascinating people on the planet. Welcome aboard, and catch you next time.